Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular kind of historical tragedy that occurs not when a civilization falls. Most civilizations fall eventually, and the falling is not always the most interesting thing about them. But when a civilization is deliberately and comprehensively destroyed, when the victors go beyond defeat to erasure, and when the record of everything that civilization was and thought and believed is filtered almost entirely through the accounts of the people who destroyed it, that is the tragedy of Carthage. And it makes tonight's story unlike most of the stories we tell here, because we are navigating a kind of double darkness. The darkness of a civilization that was genuinely extraordinary, that at its height controlled the Western Mediterranean with a commercial and military reach that no other power could match, and the additional darkness of the fact that almost nothing we know about it we learned from Carthaginians themselves. We're learning about Carthage from Rome, from the civilization that feared it, fought it, and ultimately burned it to the ground, and according to the most enduring tradition, salted the earth where it had stood so that nothing would grow there again. This is not a story about a civilization that's simply lost. Rome and Carthage fought 3 wars across a century and a half, and the outcome of those wars hung in genuine balance at several points. Points where, if a single battle had gone differently, the history of the Mediterranean world and everything that flowed from it would have been fundamentally altered. At the height of the Second Punic War, with Hannibal Barca's army encamped within sight of the walls of Rome, having destroyed 3 Roman armies and crossed the Alps with war elephants in one of the most audacious military operations in the ancient world, the possibility of a Carthaginian victory was real enough that it has preoccupied historians and military theorists ever since. The world in which Carthage won, in which the Western Mediterranean became a Punic lake, in which the Semitic commercial culture of the Phoenician diaspora, rather than the Latin military culture of the Roman Republic, shaped the subsequent history of Europe, is one of the most persistently imagined alternatives in counterfactual history, and for good reason. It was very nearly the world that actually happened. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, let the room soften. Find a comfortable position and let your breath slow down. There is a long story to tell, and it deserves the attention of a quiet night. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back, all the way back, to a city on the coast of North Africa that was, for the better part of 6 centuries, one of the most important places in the world. The city that would become Carthage was founded, according to the ancient tradition that both Roman and later sources preserve, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Lebanon, sometime in the late 9th century BCE. The conventional date is 814 BCE, though the archaeological evidence has been somewhat more ambiguous about the precise founding date than the literary tradition. The founding story that antiquity transmitted most persistently was the legend of Dido, Elissa in the Phoenician version of the tradition, a Tyrian princess who fled the court of her brother Pygmalion after he murdered her husband Sychaeus for his wealth, taking with her a group of Tyrian nobles and their followers across the Mediterranean to the coast of North Africa, where she negotiated with the local Berber king Iarbas for as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. Dido, whose intelligence matched her situation's requirements, cut the ox hide into the thinnest possible strips and laid them end to end, enclosing enough ground to build a citadel. The citadel she built on the promontory that jutted into the Bay of Tunis was called Byrsa, a word that means both citadel and, in a Greek pun that the tradition preserved, hide. and around the Byrsa the city of Carthage grew. The legend of Dido is exactly the kind of founding myth that ancient cities produced, a story that explains the origin of the name, establishes the character of the founders through a demonstration of intelligence and cunning, and provides a human drama interesting enough to be remembered and retold. Its specific details are certainly legendary rather than historical, but it captures something real about Carthage's origins. It was a Phoenician colonial city, founded by settlers from the Levantine coast, who brought with them the commercial culture, the seafaring tradition, the alphabetic script, and the religious practices of their homeland, and planted them on the North African shore. The word Punic, which the Romans used for Carthage and which modern historians use for the civilization it produced, derives from the Latin poenus, which derives from the Greek phoenix, which means Phoenician. Punic is just another word for Phoenician. The culture of Carthage was, in its origins and in its deepest character, a branch of the Phoenician civilization that had spread across the Mediterranean from its Levantine base through a network of trading colonies and commercial relationships that preceded Carthage itself by centuries. The Phoenicians deserve their own telling, which we'll give them on this channel in due time. For tonight's purposes, what matters most is what they brought to Carthage. They brought the most sophisticated commercial culture in the ancient Mediterranean, a seafaring, trading civilization whose ships range from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Africa and Iberia, carrying the goods of one civilization to the markets of another, and taking a percentage of every transaction that sustained the cities of the Levantine coast in considerable prosperity. They brought the alphabet, the Phoenician consonantal alphabet that is the ancestor, through various intermediary stages, of virtually every alphabetic writing system used in the world today, including the Greek and Latin alphabets that eventually transmitted the Western literary tradition and the Aramaic script that gave rise to Hebrew, Arabic, and the alphabets of South and Central Asia. The alphabet that Hannibal used to write his dispatches and that the Carthaginian senators used to conduct their government's business was the direct ancestor of the alphabet you are reading these words in. That connection, across 25 centuries, is worth sitting with for a moment. They brought gods. The principal deities of the Carthaginian religious tradition were Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Baal-Hamon, a sky and weather god whose worship the Phoenician tradition had developed from earlier Semitic religious sources. Tanit, a goddess whose specific character combined elements of fertility, war, and celestial power, and who became, in Carthage, perhaps the most important deity of the Punic religious tradition. Her symbol, a triangular figure with a horizontal bar and a circle on top, appearing on thousands of votive stelae in the Tophet, the sacred precinct whose archaeology has generated one of the most contentious debates in the study of ancient religion. We will return to the Tophet. It requires more than a passing mention. The geography of Carthage was one of its most important assets, and understanding it physically helps explain why the city became what it became. The site that Dido chose, whether legendarily or historically, was a promontory on the Bay of Tunis, on the coast of what is now Tunisia in North Africa. The promontory offered several natural advantages that a Phoenician colonist with commercial instincts would have immediately recognized. Deep water access on both sides of the peninsula, a defensible position connected to the mainland by only a relatively narrow neck of land, proximity to good agricultural land in the valleys behind the coast, and a position that placed it almost exactly at the geographic centre of the Mediterranean, equidistant from the Strait of Gibraltar to the west and the coast of the Levant to the east, and directly across from Sicily, the island that would prove to be both the greatest prize and the greatest source of conflict in the Western Mediterranean world. The harbour that Carthage eventually developed into was one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. Ancient sources describe two distinct harbours separated by a narrow channel: a rectangular commercial harbour where merchant vessels could load and unload their cargo, and behind it a circular military harbour, the Kothon, whose unique design placed a circular island in the centre, surrounded by a ring of ship berths capable of housing 220 warships, with the admiral's headquarters on the central island from which the entire harbour could be surveyed. The commercial and military harbours communicated with each other through the channel, and the military harbour connected to the sea through an entrance that could be closed with iron chains in times of threat. This harbour complex was the physical expression of Carthage's dual nature, both a commercial city and a military power, with the hardware for both concentrated in a single engineered landscape at the heart of the city. The city that grew around these harbours became, by the 3rd century BCE, one of the largest cities in the ancient world. But before we follow the demographics and the military history, it is worth spending some time in Carthage itself, in the streets and the markets and the temples and the harbour front, because the physical experience of the city is one of the things we have lost most completely to the destruction of 146 BCE, and to the Roman city that was built over its foundations. What can be reconstructed from the archaeology and from the ancient descriptions suggests a city of considerable visual and sensory richness. The harbour front was the city's commercial heart, and the activity there would have been continuous and overwhelming. Ships from every port in the western Mediterranean tied up at the commercial quays, unloading the goods that made Carthage rich: silver from Iberia, tin from Britain and Brittany, gold dust from West Africa, grain from Sicily and Sardinia, purple dye from the factories of Tyre, slaves from everywhere. The smell of the harbour district in an ancient Mediterranean city was its own category of experience. Salt water, fish, rotting cargo, the tar of ship maintenance, the specific smell of large numbers of people conducting large-scale commerce in close quarters in a warm climate without modern sanitation. The commercial quarter that the archaeology of the surviving Punic levels has revealed was organised around a street grid, with the warehouses and workshops of the mercantile economy, the artisans who made Carthaginian craft goods for export, the potters whose distinctive red slip ware has been found across the western Mediterranean, the workers in bronze and silver and glass who produced the luxury objects that Carthaginian traders moved through their network, occupying the lower town near the harbour. The insulae, the multi-storey residential blocks as of the Punic city, were built in a Hellenistic style that reflected the deep Greek cultural influence on Carthaginian material culture. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage was not a closed or culturally isolated city. It was a port city at the intersection of the Mediterranean's major commercial routes, and it absorbed influences from every culture with which it traded: Greek architectural styles, Egyptian religious elements, Italian pottery forms, Iberian metalworking techniques, combining them in the specifically Punic synthesis that Carthaginian material culture expressed. The markets of Carthage would have been among the most cosmopolitan spaces in the ancient world, reflecting the commercial diversity of the city's trading network. Greek merchants from Syracuse and Corinth, Libyan farmers from the agricultural hinterland bringing produce to the city, Iberian miners transporting silver, Numidian horse traders selling the cavalry mounts that were one of North Africa's most important exports, Egyptian merchants carrying luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean. All of these would have been present in the harbour district and in the commercial zones of the lower city, conducting their transactions in the various languages that Mediterranean trade required. Punic was the commercial lingua franca of the western Mediterranean as Greek was of the eastern, and the Punic-speaking merchant who could negotiate in Greek and in Libyan and in the Iberian languages of the peninsula had the commercial reach that the city's trading empire required. The religious life of the city was organized around its temples, of which the temple to Eshmun on the Bursa hill was the most prominent, a healing god, the Punic equivalent of Asclepius, whose sanctuary on the heights of the city overlooked the harbour and the bay in a position that combined strategic visibility with the specific symbolism that elevated sacred spaces communicated in the ancient world. The temple of Baal Hammon, the chief male deity, and the sanctuary of Tanit were the other major cultic centres of the city, and their worship organised the ritual calendar around which Carthaginian communal life moved. The religious festivals that marked the Carthaginian year, sacrifices, processions, the specific ceremonies associated with the major deities, were the occasions at which the commercial city reconstituted itself as a community, in the specific way that religious ritual in the ancient world served social functions that modern secular societies distribute across a wider range of institutions. With a population estimated at between 400,000 and 700,000 people, a range that reflects the uncertainty of ancient demographic estimates, but that establishes clearly that Carthage was a major urban centre by any standard. The city extended across the promontory and onto the mainland beyond, with a triple wall defending the landward approaches that ancient sources describe as one of the most formidable fortifications in the Mediterranean. 3 parallel defensive walls, each about 30 feet high, with towers at intervals and, according to the ancient descriptions, stables for horses and elephants within the wall system itself. The interior of the city was densely built, rising in some areas to 6 stories on the heights of the Bursa. The streets were laid out in a grid in the lower town, a planning approach that reflected the Hellenistic influence on Carthaginian urban design by the later period. The territory that Carthage controlled was far larger than the city itself. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage's empire encompassed the coastal regions of what are now Tunisia and Algeria, significant portions of Morocco, western Sicily and Sardinia, southern Iberia, and the scattered commercial stations and colonies that the Carthaginian trading network had established across the western Mediterranean. This was not an empire in the Roman sense. Carthage did not typically impose the kind of direct administrative control over its subject peoples that Rome did. It was more like an empire of commercial networks, in which Carthaginian commercial dominance was enforced through a combination of military superiority at sea, treaty arrangements that excluded rivals from trading in specific zones, and the collection of tribute from subject peoples who paid for Carthaginian protection rather than submitting to direct Carthaginian governance. The distinction mattered, and it produced a specifically Punic form of imperial organization that was commercially sophisticated but militarily dependent on a class of subject allies and mercenary soldiers whose loyalty was financial rather than ideological. The Carthaginian population that animated this commercial economy is worth pausing on before we examine the economy's large-scale dimensions. Not the merchant princes and the military commanders, but the broad population of the city whose daily lives the sources almost entirely ignore, and whose existence we reconstruct primarily from archaeology and inference. The Punic population of Carthage was socially stratified in ways the city's commercial character shaped. At the top were the great merchant families, the Barcids, the Magonids, the Hanons, whose wealth came from commercial investment and from the revenues of empire, and who intermarried in the patterns that maintained their social position across generations. Below them was a substantial middle class of smaller merchants, ship owners, craftsmen in the skilled trades whose products were competitive in Mediterranean markets, and agricultural landowners of the Tunisian hinterland who supplied the city with its food. At the bottom were the Libyan subjects whose labour in the fields and the workshops provided the productive base, and below them the enslaved people of various origins whose existence was the under-acknowledged precondition of the prosperity enjoyed above. The women of Carthage are particularly difficult to recover from the evidence, not because they were absent from Carthaginian life, but because the sources that describe Carthage were produced by cultures that systematically recorded male activity and ignored female experience. What archaeology shows is that Punic women participated in religious life in ways that the votive inscriptions of the Tophet document. The Dido legend itself, whatever its historical value, presents a female founder of considerable intelligence and political capability. The Alyssa who stretched the ox hide into strips was demonstrating precisely the commercial intelligence that the Carthaginian elite valued above all things, and the legend chose to attribute that intelligence to a woman. The Carthaginian economy was the engine of everything else, and its specific character shaped the civilization in ways that distinguished it sharply from both its Phoenician predecessors and its Roman rivals. Carthage was, above all, a commercial civilization. The Carthaginian elite, whose names appear in the sources, the Barcid family, the Magonids before them, the great merchant families whose members served as suffets, the pair of annually elected magistrates who governed the city, were men whose wealth was rooted in trade, in the control of commercial networks, in the revenues of empire and of the agricultural territories of North Africa, that Carthage had developed into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the ancient Mediterranean. The Carthaginian agricultural tradition was sophisticated enough that the Roman Senate, after destroying the city in 146 BCE, specifically ordered the preservation and translation into Latin of the agricultural manual of Magu of Carthage, a 28-book work on farming practices that the Romans considered valuable enough to save even as they were burning everything else. The agricultural territory of North Africa that Carthage controlled, the fertile plains of what the Romans called Africa Proconsularis, the region of Tunisia and northeastern Algeria, was intensively cultivated with a system that combined grain production, olive culture, viticulture, and the raising of livestock in a diversified agricultural economy of considerable productivity. The Carthaginians developed irrigation systems, introduced new crop varieties, and applied a systematic approach to land management that the Roman agricultural writers found admirable and worthy of detailed study. This agricultural productivity was the economic foundation that sustained Carthage's commercial operations and its military ambitions, providing the food surplus that allowed the city to support a large non-agricultural population, and the revenue base that funded the mercenary armies and the war fleets that were the instruments of Carthaginian power. The specific exploration achievements of Carthage are among the most remarkable and most debated aspects of its history, and they deserve more than passing mention because they represent the farthest reach of the Punic commercial imagination. The Periplus, the sailing narrative, attributed to a Carthaginian named Hanno, describes a voyage along the West African coast that may have reached as far as modern Sierra Leone, or even further south, establishing trading contacts with African coastal peoples and recording natural phenomena, including what appears to be a volcanic eruption, that suggest the voyage was real rather than literary invention. If Hanno's Periplus records genuine exploration, Carthaginian navigators reached sub-Saharan Africa more than 2 millennia before the Portuguese expeditions that European history books credit with the discovery of the same coasts. The northern parallel to Hanno's voyage is the exploration attributed to Hamilcar, another Carthaginian navigator who reportedly sailed northward along the Atlantic coast of Europe, reaching Britain and possibly Ireland and the coast of Brittany. the Tin Islands and the northern seas that ancient sources describe in terms suggesting genuine, if terrifying, experience of North Atlantic conditions. The specific descriptions in the ancient sources that preserve Hamilcar's voyage, of fog, of seaweed-choked waters, of shallow seas and a sun that seems distant and cold, read like the observations of someone who had actually been in the North Atlantic rather than imagining it. Whether these voyages were conducted as secret intelligence-gathering operations designed to protect Carthaginian commercial monopolies in the Atlantic, or as genuine exploration motivated by commercial curiosity, or both, they represent a maritime ambition that Rome never matched, and that the medieval European explorers who eventually repeated the same routes had no knowledge of. The Carthaginian commercial network that these voyages extended was built on the specific Phoenician understanding that the most valuable commercial position is not the producer of goods, but the controller of routes, the power that mediates between producers and consumers, extracting value from the movement of goods rather than from their creation. This is the commercial philosophy that the Phoenicians had developed and that Carthage inherited and extended, and it is a philosophy that is recognizably modern. The logic of the middleman, the value adder, the network controller who becomes indispensable by being present at every transaction. Carthage was the Amazon of the ancient Mediterranean world, not producing most of what it sold, but organizing the networks through which everything moved and taking its percentage at every stage. The specific form of commercial intelligence this required, the knowledge of where to find what goods, at what price, in exchange for what, was the intellectual capital of the Punic merchant class, and its destruction with the city was as complete a loss as the libraries. The Phoenician world from which Carthage sprang had been the dominant commercial civilization of the Mediterranean for centuries before Carthage rose to prominence, and understanding the broader Phoenician network helps explain both what Carthage inherited and how it eventually came to surpass its Levantine parent cities. The Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and their neighbours on the Lebanese coast, had been the great maritime traders of the eastern Mediterranean since the late Bronze Age, operating in the commercial networks that connected Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant in a web of exchange that the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE disrupted but did not permanently destroy. In the aftermath of that collapse, the Phoenician cities rebuilt their commercial networks with the specific advantage that the collapse had eliminated most of their major competitors, and they expanded those networks westward into the central and western Mediterranean in the centuries between roughly 1000 and 700 BCE. The Phoenician westward expansion was driven by the search for metal, specifically for silver, tin, and copper, the metals that the eastern Mediterranean economies demanded for coinage and for bronze production. The silver mines of Iberia, in the region the Phoenicians called Tarshish and the Greeks called Tartessos, were one of the great prizes of the ancient Mediterranean world, accessible only to those who could navigate the Strait of Gibraltar and establish the trading relationships with the Iberian peoples that allowed the silver to be extracted and transported. The Phoenicians got there first. Their trading posts along the southern coast of Iberia, Gadir, the modern Cadiz, founded around 1100 BCE in the traditional dating and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe, gave them privileged access to the silver trade that they exploited for centuries before Greek competition began to challenge their Western Mediterranean dominance. Carthage was established in this context of Phoenician westward expansion, on the route between the Levantine home cities and the Iberian silver mines, and its position gave it a natural role as the relay point the way station, and eventually the organizing center of the Phoenician Western Mediterranean network. As the Levantine home cities came under the pressure of Assyrian and then Babylonian imperial expansion in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian siege of Tyre in the late 8th century, the Babylonian destruction of Sidon in 677 BCE, the gradual erosion of Phoenician independence under Mesopotamian hegemony, Carthage absorbed increasing commercial and political authority over the Western colonies that the home cities could no longer effectively supervise. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage was not merely a Phoenician colony, but the dominant power in the Western Phoenician world, exercising the commercial and eventually the military hegemony over the network that Tyre had once provided. The Greeks were the other major power in the Western Mediterranean during the period of Carthaginian rise, and the relationship between Carthage and the Greek world was one of the defining tensions of the ancient Mediterranean. Greek colonization in the Western Mediterranean had proceeded more or less simultaneously with the Phoenician, though on different vectors. The Greeks had settled Sicily, southern Italy, southern France, and the eastern coast of Iberia, creating the string of poli that made the Western Mediterranean a Greek world as well as a Phoenician one. Massalia, modern Marseille, was a Greek colony. Syracuse in Sicily was a Greek colony. Naples, Neapolis, the new city, was a Greek colony. The Greeks and the Carthaginians competed for commercial dominance in the Western Mediterranean, and that competition was expressed both in commercial rivalry and in occasional military conflict. The Battle of Eulalia in 535 BCE, fought off the coast of Corsica between a Carthaginian and Etruscan fleet on one side and a Greek fleet on the other, was one of the first major naval engagements in the Western Mediterranean and established something important about the balance of power. The Greeks won technically but lost strategically, withdrawing from their colony at Eulalia and ceding dominance of Corsica and Sardinia to the Carthaginian sphere. The battle was one marker in the gradual definition of zones of influence that shaped the Western Mediterranean for the following 3 centuries. Carthage dominant in North Africa, Sardinia, Western Sicily and Iberia, the Greeks dominant in eastern Sicily, southern Italy and the coast of France, and a persistent zone of competition and conflict in Sicily that would eventually involve Rome as well. Sicily was the pivot of Western Mediterranean politics for centuries, and understanding why requires understanding the island's geography and productivity. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean, positioned at the narrowest point of the sea's central corridor, dividing the eastern and western basins in a way that made it strategically irreplaceable for anyone who wished to control Mediterranean navigation. It was also extraordinarily fertile. The grain of Sicily fed a significant portion of the ancient world, and control of Sicilian grain production was a strategic asset of the First Order. The western portion of Sicily was Carthaginian territory, organized around the Punic settlements of Panormus, Lilybaeum and Motia. The eastern portion was Greek territory, organized around the great city of Syracuse. The boundary between these spheres was contested, renegotiated and fought over repeatedly across the 5th, 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, and it was the conflict over Sicily that eventually drew Rome into the Mediterranean power competition in a way that would change everything. The political system that governed Carthage was one of the more sophisticated constitutional arrangements in the ancient world, and its specific character, oligarchic in its structure, with significant checks on individual power, shaped the way Carthage fought its wars in ways that would eventually prove fatal. The city was governed by a council of elders, the Council of Elders, or Senate, in the Roman terminology that our sources apply to it, which was dominated by the wealthiest commercial families and which exercised the primary authority over foreign policy and military command. 2 annually elected magistrates called suffets. The title is cognate with the Hebrew shofet, judge, and reflects the common Semitic origin of both the Phoenician and the Hebrew political traditions, presided over the council and conducted the city's administration in a pair that the Romans found comparable to their own consular system, though the suffetes had less executive power than Roman consuls, and more of the authority of the state was vested in the aristocratic Senate. The Council of 104 was a judicial body with powers of oversight over military commanders that had no Roman equivalent. It could try generals for their conduct of campaigns and execute them if found guilty of treachery or incompetence, a power that created a specific and well-documented tendency among Carthaginian commanders to be risk-averse, because the punishment for failure was not merely political embarrassment but death. The Carthaginian general who lost a battle faced scrutiny from a council that had the power to crucify him, and this oversight mechanism shaped Carthaginian military culture in ways that consistently disadvantaged it relative to the Roman willingness to absorb catastrophic defeats and keep fighting. Carthage lost the First Punic War in part because its generals were too cautious to press advantages and too afraid to risk decisive action. Rome kept fighting after Cannae, one of the worst defeats any army has ever suffered, because its political culture had no mechanism for punishing a general who was killed in battle. The military force that Carthage deployed was another expression of its commercial character. Carthage did not raise armies from its own citizen population in the way that Rome did. It hired them. The Carthaginian military was primarily a mercenary force, recruited from the diverse peoples of the Western Mediterranean, Libyan and Numidian infantry and cavalry, Iberian and Celtiberian infantry, Balearic slingers, Gallic warriors, held together by Carthaginian officers, Carthaginian money, and the specific quality of Carthaginian military leadership that the Barcid family would demonstrate in spectacular fashion during the Second Punic War. This mercenary army was in some ways more versatile and more capable than a citizen levy. It could draw on the specific military skills of many different peoples, combining the light cavalry of the Numidians with the heavy infantry of Iberian warriors and the missile troops of the Balearic Islands in combined arms arrangements of genuine tactical sophistication. But it was also fundamentally different in its motivations from a Roman citizen army fighting for its farms and its families. Mercenaries fought for money, and when the money stopped coming, or when the campaign went badly enough that the risk exceeded the reward, mercenaries had options that citizens did not. The navy was the one arm of Carthaginian military power that was distinctly its own. Not mercenary but Carthaginian in its crews and its commanders, reflecting the seafaring tradition that the Phoenician heritage had bequeathed to the city. The Carthaginian war fleet of the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE was the dominant naval force in the western Mediterranean, operating the Quinquereme, the 5-banked galley that was the battleship of the ancient Mediterranean, with a skill and experience that no rival could match. The mastery of the sea was so central to Carthaginian strategic thinking that when Rome emerged as a serious rival in the 3rd century BCE, the Carthaginian assumption was that Rome could be beaten at sea even if it could not be beaten on land. That assumption was one of the most consequential strategic errors in ancient history. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE with a dispute over Sicily that neither Rome nor Carthage had deliberately engineered, and that both sides stumbled into through a combination of alliance obligations, strategic opportunism, and the failure to recognize how quickly a local conflict could escalate into a general war. Before we follow the war's specific events, it is worth understanding what each side was fighting for and what each side was fighting with, because the asymmetry between Roman and Carthaginian military cultures was the central fact of the First Punic War. and the source of its most surprising results. Carthage in 264 BCE was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean with a century of Sicilian involvement behind it. Its navy was the finest in the world. Its Sicilian cities, Panormus, Lilybaeum, and Drepanum, were heavily fortified and well supplied. Its generals were experienced in the specific conditions of Sicilian warfare. On land, its mercenary army was competent if expensive. At sea, it had no rival. Rome in 264 BCE had never fought a naval battle. Its entire military tradition was land-based. The Manipular Legion, the system of allied Italian manpower that had allowed Rome to field army after army through the long wars of Italian unification, the tactical flexibility of the Roman military formation, were all oriented toward fighting on the Italian peninsula in the conditions of Italian terrain. Rome had a small fleet used for coastal raiding and supply, nothing that could be described as a battle fleet. It had no experienced admirals. It had no rowers trained to the standards that Mediterranean galley warfare required. To win the First Punic War, Rome was going to have to fight Carthage at sea, and to fight Carthage at sea, Rome was going to have to do something that its entire military tradition had not prepared it for. What made this possible was the specific character of Roman institutional organization. Rome in the mid-3rd century BCE was not yet the empire of later centuries. It was a republic of approximately 3 million people, organized around a senatorial aristocracy that combined military command with civic administration, and that possessed, in its collective form, an organizational intelligence and a willingness to commit resources to military objectives that no contemporary state could quite match. When the Senate decided that Rome needed a navy, the organizational machinery of the Roman state produced a navy. The speed of the production, the famous 60 days for 120 warships, reflects this organizational capacity more than any particular naval genius, and the Romans' willingness to accept and learn from early defeats at sea, rather than concluding that naval warfare was not something Rome could do, was the expression of a strategic culture that treated military failure as a problem to be solved rather than a verdict to be accepted. That neither Rome nor Carthage had deliberately engineered, and that both sides stumbled into through a combination of alliance obligations, strategic opportunism, and the failure to recognize how quickly a local conflict could escalate into a general war. The Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana at the northeastern tip of the island, called on both Rome and Carthage for help against the Syracusan king Hiero, and both Rome and Carthage responded, finding themselves unexpectedly on opposite sides of a Sicilian crisis that neither had anticipated managing. The war that followed lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 BCE, and it was a war that Rome had no business winning on any prior calculation of the balance of power. Rome in 264 BCE was a land power whose naval experience was essentially non-existent. Its history had been one of infantry warfare on the Italian peninsula, and its fleet was negligible by Mediterranean standards. Carthage in 264 BCE was the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean, with 2 centuries of seafaring tradition and a war fleet that its opponents had never seriously challenged. The conventional strategic analysis would have said that Rome could fight Carthage on land and Carthage could fight Rome at sea, and that the war would therefore be decided by whichever theatre Rome could force Carthage into, or Carthage could force Rome into. What happened instead was one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in the history of ancient warfare. Rome decided to fight Carthage at sea. In the space of approximately 60 days in 261 BCE, the timeline is disputed by scholars, but the speed is not. Rome built a fleet of 120 warships, the quinqueremes and triremes, whose design Roman shipbuilders are said to have copied from a captured Carthaginian vessel that had run aground. 60 days for 120 warships by a civilization with no significant naval tradition, using what was essentially an appropriated foreign design. Whether this tradition is entirely accurate in its details or somewhat embellished in the telling, the core fact is that Rome built a competitive navy in a very short time from nothing, which required organizational capacity of an extraordinary order. The Romans then equipped this navy with a device that their own tactical ingenuity produced in response to the recognition that Carthaginian rowers were better trained, and Carthaginian naval tactics were more sophisticated than anything Rome could immediately match. The corvus, the raven, was a boarding bridge mounted on a rotating pole on the bow of a Roman warship, designed to drop onto the deck of an enemy vessel, locking the two ships together with an iron spike, and converting a naval engagement into an infantry battle, where Roman soldiers could fight on the terms they knew best. It was an elegant solution to the problem of fighting at sea, when your sailors could not yet beat the enemy at their own game. Change the game. The corvus was unstable in heavy weather, which may be one reason it disappeared from the Roman navy after the First Punic War, but in the engagements where it was used effectively, it transformed Roman naval defeats into Roman naval victories by the simple expedient of making the sea behave more like land. The Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, the first major engagement of the Roman fleet, was the first Roman naval victory in Mediterranean history, and it was won largely through the corvus. The Roman commander Gaius Duilius, whose victory was commemorated by a column in Rome decorated with the rams of captured Carthaginian ships, the columna rostrata, part of which survives today in a later copy in the Capitoline museums, became the first Roman to celebrate a naval triumph, an event whose significance the Romans themselves clearly understood as marking a new phase of their history. A land power had just beaten the Mediterranean's greatest naval power at sea. Everything that followed flowed from that. The First Punic War was not decided quickly or cleanly. It was a grinding, expensive 23-year attrition in which both sides suffered catastrophic losses, not only in battle but in storms, which destroyed Roman fleets with a thoroughness that battle alone did not achieve. The Roman disaster off Cape Palinurus in 253 BCE, which lost approximately 150 ships to a storm, and the disaster off Camarina in 255 BCE, which lost approximately 364 ships returning from an expedition to Africa that had briefly threatened Carthage's home territory, were losses of a scale that would have ended most ancient states' capacity to continue fighting. Rome replaced the ships, recruited new crews, and kept fighting, displaying the organizational resilience and the refusal to accept defeat that would become its most consistent strategic characteristic across 4 centuries of imperial expansion. The war ended in 241 BCE with a Roman naval victory at the Aegates Islands, off the western tip of Sicily, that destroyed the Carthaginian fleet that was attempting to resupply the Sicilian garrisons, and that left Carthage unable to continue the war. The peace terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered Sicily, agreed to pay a substantial indemnity, released Roman prisoners without ransom, and accepted a treaty that effectively acknowledged Roman dominance of the western Mediterranean. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Mediterranean world had a new major power, and that power was Rome. The years immediately following the First Punic War nearly destroyed Carthage not from the outside but from the inside. The Mercenary War, also called the Truceless War, The bellum inexpiabile, the war without mercy, was an uprising of the mercenaries who had fought for Carthage in Sicily, and who, on returning to North Africa, found that the city could not or would not pay the wages it owed them. The mercenary war reveals something important about the structural vulnerabilities of the Carthaginian military system that the war's famous dramatic qualities tend to obscure. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries was not merely a practical arrangement for obtaining military manpower without depleting the citizen population. It was a social contract that required the city to maintain the financial credibility that made the contract work. Mercenaries fought for money. When the money stopped, or when the city began to prevaricate about payment, the mercenaries' loyalty evaporated with a speed that was entirely rational, given the basis on which it had been extended. The crisis of 241 BCE was not that Carthage had used mercenaries. The crisis was that Carthage had used them, failed to pay them, and then found itself geographically and militarily positioned, so that the unpaid soldiers could not simply leave. They were in North Africa, across the sea from most of their home territories, with Carthage between them and any exit route that did not require passing through Carthaginian territory. The Libyan population that joined the revolt adds another dimension to the mercenary war that the Roman sources' focus on the mercenaries tends to underemphasize. The Libyans, the Berber farming population of the North African hinterland that Carthage had controlled and taxed for centuries, had been paying tribute to Carthage under arrangements that the First Punic War had made considerably more onerous, as the city extracted additional tax revenues to fund the war effort and then the indemnity payments afterward. The Libyan uprising was not merely opportunistic support for the mercenaries' grievances. It was the eruption of long-accumulated resentment against a Carthaginian colonial system that extracted from its subject population without providing sufficient security or benefit in return. The Libyan towns that opened their gates to the mercenary army were making a statement about their relationship to Carthage that went beyond the immediate military situation. Hamilcar's suppression of the mercenary war was accomplished through a combination of tactical skill and psychological manipulation that prefigured his son's later genius. He divided the mercenary coalition by exploiting the differences between its components, playing the various nationalities of the mercenary force against each other, negotiating separately with Libyan towns that offered to surrender, using clemency toward those who submitted early and extreme violence against those who continued to resist in ways calculated to make the costs of continued resistance visible and credible. The final battle, fought in the Soar, a ravine or confined valley where Hamilcar trapped the mercenary remnant, was less a military engagement than a slaughter, and Hamilcar allowed it to be as complete as it was because he understood that a mercenary war that ended in a negotiated compromise would leave the structural problem unresolved. It needed to end in the total defeat of the mercenaries and the complete restoration of Carthaginian authority in North Africa, or the lessons the revolt would teach to future mercenary contingents would be wrong ones. The uprising began in 241 BCE and lasted nearly 4 years, producing some of the most extreme violence in the ancient world's long catalogue of extreme violence. Both sides executed their prisoners in the most brutal ways available, and the conflict drew in the Libyan population of the Carthaginian hinterland, who saw in the mercenaries' revolt an opportunity to challenge the Carthaginian domination that had exploited their labour and their territory for generations. Carthage came close to destruction. The city itself was threatened. Its North African territories rose in rebellion. The mercenary army that Carthage had relied on for the previous generation was turned against the city it had defended, and the combination of military and economic crisis that the mercenary war produced would have finished most ancient states. The man who saved Carthage who organized the suppression of the revolt, defeated the mercenary army in a series of campaigns of increasing brutality, and restored Carthaginian control of North Africa, was Hamilcar Barca, and his name and his family's subsequent career are the key to understanding everything that followed. Hamilcar Barca is one of the most important figures in the ancient Mediterranean world, and he is also one of the most obscure, because almost everything we know about him comes from Roman sources that had reason to present him in ways that served Roman narratives. What the sources agree on is that he was a military commander of exceptional ability, that his campaigns in Sicily during the First Punic War had been more successful than those of most of his contemporaries, and that his suppression of the mercenary war displayed the same combination of tactical intelligence, personal courage, and ruthless determination that his more famous son would later demonstrate on a larger stage. He crushed the revolt with a thoroughness that left Carthage intact and his own reputation elevated, and then, rather than settling into the comfortable retirement that a successful general might have expected, he turned his attention to the project that would make the Barcid family the most consequential dynasty in Carthaginian history, the conquest of Iberia. The Iberian campaign that Hamilcar led from 237 BCE onward was not authorized by the Carthaginian Senate with the enthusiasm that its subsequent importance might suggest. The senatorial families who controlled Carthaginian politics were not uniformly enthusiastic about Hamilcar's military ambitions, and there was a significant faction, led by the Hanno family, which represented the more cautious, land-based agricultural interests of the Carthaginian elite, that preferred consolidating the North African territories to pursuing expensive overseas adventures. Hamilcar went to Iberia anyway, with his sons, including the 9-year-old Hannibal, who, according to the most famous story in Barcid legend, begged to accompany his father and was told by Hamilcar that he could come only if he swore eternal enmity to Rome. Hannibal swore. He kept the oath. The Iberian campaign lasted for nearly 2 decades under 3 Barcid commanders, Hamilcar until his death by drowning in 228 BCE, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair until his assassination in 221 BCE, and then Hannibal, who took command at the age of 25 and immediately began preparing the operation that would bring him to the gates of Rome. The Barcids built in Iberia something that Carthage had never quite had before: a territorial empire with loyal subject populations, a systematic revenue base from the silver mines of the south and east, and a professional army that had been trained and seasoned through years of continuous campaigning against the Iberian tribes. The capital they established at Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, was a city on the Carthaginian model, positioned on a promontory with harbour access and silver mines nearby. And it was from Carthago Nova that Hannibal launched the campaign that would bring him to the Alps and beyond. The specific event that triggered the Second Punic War was the Siege of Saguntum, a city on the eastern coast of Iberia that had a treaty relationship with Rome, and that Hannibal besieged and captured in 219 BCE, knowing that Rome would consider it a casus belli. Rome did. Ambassadors were sent to Carthage demanding that Hannibal be surrendered for punishment. The Carthaginian council refused. The war began. And Hannibal, who had been planning the campaign for years, and who understood Rome's strategic situation with unusual clarity, set in motion the most audacious military operation of the ancient world. Hannibal Barca is one of the greatest military commanders in human history, and the assessment is not Roman flattery. The Romans had every reason to minimize his abilities, and they still acknowledged them. His name means grace of Baal in Phoenician, Hannibal, the grace or favour of the supreme deity, and he had been raised in the Barcid military tradition since childhood, accompanying his father's campaigns in Iberia from the age of 9 and serving as an officer through the rest of the Iberian pacification under his father's successors. By the time he took command of the Iberian army at 25, he was a man of comprehensive military education, deep personal charisma, and a strategic understanding of the Roman-Carthaginian conflict that went beyond anything his contemporaries on either side possessed. His strategic analysis was approximately as follows. Carthage could not beat Rome by fighting a defensive war in Africa or in Sicily. The sea approach to Italy was commanded by Rome, which now had a navy of its own. The direct sea crossing to Italy was therefore unavailable. But Rome's strategic position had a vulnerability that the Italian campaign route would exploit. Rome's power depended on the loyalty of its Italian allies, the peoples of the peninsula who provided the manpower that Roman armies required. If Rome could be beaten decisively enough in Italy itself, beaten not once but repeatedly, beaten in battles so destructive that the confidence of the Italian allies in Roman protection was shattered, those allies might defect. An Italy in which Rome's allies had abandoned it was an Italy in which Roman manpower was reduced by more than half, in which the logistical support for Roman armies disappeared, in which the political foundation of Roman dominance of the peninsula was destroyed. Hannibal did not intend to destroy Rome by sieging it. He intended to destroy the Roman alliance system by fighting Rome to the point of political collapse. The route to Italy that Hannibal chose was the land route, west along the coast of Iberia, across the Pyrenees through southern Gaul, and across the Alps. The crossing of the Alps in the late autumn of 218 BCE has been one of the enduring images of ancient history for 2 millennia, and it deserves the reputation. Hannibal led an army that ancient sources put at around 38,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, plus the war elephants that were simultaneously the most dramatic and the least practically significant element of his force, across mountain passes in conditions of snow, ice, rockfall and hostile attack by alpine tribes that produced casualties on a scale that left his army at the Po Valley with perhaps 25,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. He had lost perhaps a third of his force in the crossing. What he had gained was something that no calculation of losses and gains entirely captures: the psychological effect of an army appearing in northern Italy from a direction that the Romans had not prepared for and had not fully believed possible. The Italian campaign that followed produced 3 of the greatest Roman defeats in the Republic's history in less than 2 years. The Battle of the Trebia in December 218 BCE, where Hannibal destroyed a Roman army by using the cold of the river crossing to numb the Roman infantry before they reached his lines, and then unleashing his Numidian cavalry to envelop them. The Battle of Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE, the largest ambush in military history, where Hannibal concealed his entire army in the hills above the lake shore and destroyed a Roman army of approximately 30,000 in an engagement so close and so violent that the soldiers fighting in the middle of it reportedly did not notice an earthquake that occurred during the battle. And then Cannae, in August 216 BCE, the battle that military academies still study, where Hannibal, with an army smaller than the Roman force facing him, produced the most complete tactical encirclement in ancient history, killing approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon, the greatest single-day death toll of any battle in the ancient world. After Cannae, virtually every Roman ally in southern Italy defected. Capua, the second city of Italy, went over to Hannibal. Bruttium, Lucania, Samnium, the south of the peninsula that Rome had conquered and subdued over a century of warfare, switched sides. The kingdom of Macedon entered an alliance with Hannibal against Rome. Syracuse, the great Greek city of Sicily, broke with Rome. Hannibal had, in 2 years of campaigning, achieved exactly the strategic objective he had set out to achieve. He had shattered Rome's alliance system and threatened to unravel the political structure of Roman Italy. And then he did not march on Rome. This is the decision that historians and military theorists have argued about ever since, and the argument will probably never be fully resolved, because the evidence for what Hannibal was thinking does not survive in the form that would allow certainty. The Hannibal story, in which the Numidian cavalry commander tells Hannibal after Cannae that he knows how to use a victory but not how to finish one, and that in 4 days Hannibal could be dining on the capital, is almost certainly an invention of the tradition rather than a historical exchange. But it captures the genuine historical puzzle. Why did Hannibal not march on Rome after Cannae? The city was effectively undefended. The armies that could have stopped him had been destroyed. The psychological shock of Cannae was real and deep. A march on Rome in August 216 BCE might have been decisive. The most convincing answer is that Hannibal's strategic plan did not include the capture of Rome. He did not have siege equipment. He did not have the manpower to maintain a siege of a city of that size and fortification. His strategy was to isolate Rome from its allies, not to storm its walls, and he judged, probably correctly, that an unsuccessful siege of Rome would cost him more than the march would gain. The defection of Capua and the southern allies meant that his strategy was working. He had not failed at Cannae. He had succeeded beyond any previous expectation. What he had not counted on was the specific quality of Roman response to catastrophe. Rome's response to Cannae was the thing that Hannibal had not been able to factor into his strategic plan, because it was genuinely unprecedented. When the Senate convened in the days after the battle, with the reports of the dead arriving and the panic of the surviving citizens palpable in the streets of the city, it did not negotiate. It did not send envoys to Hannibal to discuss terms. It refused to ransom the 8,000 prisoners who had survived the battle, a refusal that cost the lives of those men, but that communicated to every Italian ally who was watching that Rome was not going to admit defeat regardless of the losses. The Senate enrolled 2 new legions from freedmen and criminals. It sent to Sicily for the gladiators and criminals who could be converted to soldiers. It refused to receive Hannibal's peace envoys, and it appointed Fabius Maximus Verrucosus as dictator, with a mandate to fight Hannibal in a way that Hannibal could not counter, by refusing to fight him. The Fabian strategy, what Hannibal's soldiers called the strategy of the dictator, what the Roman popular tradition called the strategy of the cunctator, the delayer, was to shadow Hannibal's army through southern Italy without engaging it directly, to cut off foraging parties, to attack isolated detachments, to deny Hannibal the decisive engagement that he needed to complete the destruction of Roman power. The strategy was unpopular at Rome, where the traditional culture valued aggressive action, and where the spectacle of Hannibal marching unchallenged through Italy was politically intolerable. It was sound. The Italian allies who had defected to Hannibal expected Carthaginian military protection and Carthaginian supplies. When Hannibal could not protect them from Roman retribution, and could not supply them from a base that was shrinking rather than growing, the political calculation that had led them to defect began to reverse itself. The war in Italy lasted 15 years after Cannae, and those 15 years had a specific texture that the dramatic peaks of the campaign, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, Zama, tend to overshadow. Hannibal's army in Italy for those 15 years was a force sustained entirely by what it could extract from the Italian countryside and from the territories of the allies who had joined him, without a secure supply line from Carthage, without a port of entry through which reinforcements could easily flow, and without the permanent base of operations that conventional military doctrine of any period would have considered the minimum precondition for a sustained offensive campaign. The Carthaginian Senate's failure to support Hannibal in Italy is one of the most contested questions in the historiography of the Second Punic War. Hannibal repeatedly requested reinforcements and supplies that the Senate in Carthage either could not or did not provide. The traditional explanation, which Hannibal himself apparently endorsed in his bitterness about the outcome, is that his enemies in the Hanno faction at Carthage were content to see him struggle in Italy without resources that might increase his personal power and therefore their political rivals' authority. The more structurally sympathetic explanation is that Carthage genuinely lacked the naval power to project force into Italian waters against Roman interception, that the reinforcements that were sent to Iberia under Hasdrubal were a rational response to the Roman counteroffensive that Scipio was mounting there, and that the Senate was making difficult decisions about resource allocation under conditions of genuine strategic constraint. What the 15 years in Italy looked like from the perspective of the Italian communities that had defected to Hannibal is a dimension of the war that the Roman sources record only obliquely, but that the archaeology of southern Italian cities from the period illuminates with growing detail. Capua, the great Campanian city whose defection had seemed the decisive crack in the Italian alliance, was besieged and reconquered by Rome in 211 BCE, and the punishment the Romans inflicted on it was exemplary in the most Roman sense of that word. Its leading citizens were executed, its senate abolished, its land confiscated, its political independence permanently ended. Capua became a ward of Rome, governed by a prefect, stripped of the autonomy that had made it the second city of Italy. The message to every other ally that was watching, stay with Rome or face what Capua faced, was received and understood. The smaller communities of the south that had gone over to Hannibal experienced the war's later years as a kind of extended catastrophe, caught between Hannibal's need to extract supply from the territory he controlled and Rome's systematic campaign of retribution against communities that had defected. The archaeological evidence of destruction and abandonment in southern Italian communities from the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE reflects a war that, whatever its strategic character at the level of the major engagements, was at the local level a grinding destruction of the communities in whose territory it was fought. The Samnites, the Lucanians, the Bruttians, the peoples of the Italian south who had the longest history of resistance to Roman dominance and who had therefore been most willing to see in Hannibal's arrival an opportunity for liberation, paid the heaviest price when Rome won. Their territories were incorporated, their autonomy reduced, their populations thinned by war and its attendant famines and diseases. The war in Italy lasted 15 years after Cannae, and during those 15 years Hannibal remained in the peninsula, unable to deliver the decisive blow that his strategy required, and unable to be driven out by an army that had learned, at enormous cost, how to fight him without being destroyed. His brother Hasdrubal marched from Iberia with reinforcements in 207 BCE, crossing the Alps as Hannibal had done and descending into northern Italy. The news of Hasdrubal's march reached both Hannibal in the south and the Roman armies in the north simultaneously, and the battle that followed, the Battle of the Metaurus River, where the Roman consuls Gaius Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator caught Hasdrubal's army and destroyed it before Hannibal could march north to join him, was the decisive battle of the entire war in Italy. Hasdrubal was killed. His head was thrown into Hannibal's camp. Hannibal understood what it meant. The war ended not with Hannibal's defeat in Italy, but with the Roman counter-invasion of Africa under Publius Cornelius Scipio, Scipio Africanus, the greatest Roman general of the age, and the story of how Scipio came to command the African campaign is itself revealing about Roman political culture in the later stages of the war. Scipio was the son and nephew of Roman commanders who had been killed fighting the Barcids in Iberia in 211 BCE, the same year that Capua fell to Rome and the same year that the strategic situation in Iberia had seemed most desperate. He was 25 years old when he was elected by the Popular Assembly to command the Iberian campaign, an age and a procedure that both violated the conventions of the Roman military command system, which normally required candidates to have served the full cursus honorum of offices before receiving a major command. The Popular Assembly bypassed the conventions because there were no senior commanders available who wanted the Iberian assignment, which had consumed 2 Roman armies and 2 senior commanders in the previous decade, and had the reputation of a posting from which generals did not return with their reputations intact. Scipio returned with his reputation more than intact. The Iberian campaign of 210 to 206 BCE, in which he systematically dismantled the Barcid military and political infrastructure that Hamilcar and Hasdrubal and Hannibal had spent 2 decades building, displayed the same combination of tactical intelligence, strategic vision, and personal leadership ability that Hannibal himself had demonstrated, but applied with the organizational resources of Rome behind it, rather than the improvised supply arrangements that Hannibal had managed in Italy. The capture of Carthago Nova in 209 BCE, conducted by an assault that combined a sea landing, a direct assault on the landward walls, and a tidal approach through the lagoon that Scipio's scouts had identified as passable at low tide, was the kind of operation, using multiple simultaneous approaches to overwhelm a defender's ability to respond, that characterized his best campaigns. The Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, where Scipio defeated a substantially larger Carthaginian army in Spain by reversing the order of battle that Hannibal had used at Cannae, placing his best Roman troops on the flanks rather than in the centre, and using a complex lateral manoeuvre during the battle to envelop the Carthaginian formation, was a demonstration that he had not merely learned from Hannibal's tactics, but had developed genuine innovations of his own. The political battle to receive the command for the African invasion was as hard as any military campaign Scipio fought. The Fabian faction in the Senate, the conservatives who had favoured the cautious strategy of avoiding decisive engagement with Hannibal, and who were suspicious of any general whose personal popularity and military ambition resembled what had made Hannibal dangerous, opposed the African campaign on grounds that combined genuine strategic caution with personal political rivalry. Fabius himself argued that Hannibal should be forced out of Italy rather than lured away from it, and that an African campaign risked leaving Italy undefended while Hannibal was still there. The argument had a superficial plausibility that the political popularity of the African campaign overrode, and Scipio received the command. He was 31 years old. Hannibal's army in Italy at the time of the recall had been reduced to a corps of veterans, perhaps 12 to 15,000 men, the survivors of 15 years of continuous campaigning without significant reinforcement. They had never been defeated in a pitched battle. They had fought dozens of engagements from the Alps to Calabria and had won almost all of them. They were, by any measure, one of the most experienced and effective fighting forces in the ancient world. But they were also 15 years older than the army that had crossed the Alps, exhausted in a way that only prolonged campaign without prospect of resolution produces, and increasingly isolated in a southern Italy that Rome was systematically reclaiming around them. When the order came to embark at Croton on the Bruttian coast and sail for Africa, they obeyed. What they felt about leaving, about the country where so many of their companions had died, and where they had accomplished so much to no final strategic purpose, the sources do not record in any way that allows confidence about the emotional truth. Hannibal landed in North Africa, moved to Hadrumetum, and began recruiting a force from whatever was available. The army he assembled for the Zama campaign was numerically substantial, but qualitatively very different from the force he had led in Italy. The core of his Italian veterans formed the third line of his formation at Zama. The experienced troops held in reserve the final line of defence. In front of them were recently recruited African levies and the mercenaries that Carthage could still afford to hire. In front of those were the war elephants, 80 of them, more elephants than Hannibal had deployed in any previous engagement, but hastily trained and not the seasoned animals that an experienced Carthaginian commander would have preferred. Scipio's response to the elephants was the training he had instituted. Lanes in the Roman formation through which the elephants could be channeled if they charged, combined with trumpet signals designed to frighten the animals and turn them back toward their own lines. The tactic worked. The elephants that didn't run away ran through the Carthaginian formation rather than through the Roman one. The Numidian cavalry on Scipio's right flank, commanded by Massinissa, the Numidian prince who had switched from the Carthaginian to the Roman alliance, and who would later spend decades exploiting his alliance with Rome to seize Carthaginian territory, defeated the Carthaginian cavalry and drove it from the field. Scipio's Italian cavalry on the left did the same. Hannibal's cavalry was gone. His infantry fought the Romans in a series of bitter engagements that moved through his three lines one by one. But when the Roman cavalry returned from pursuing the Carthaginian horse and struck Hannibal's veterans in the rear, the battle was decided. Hannibal, for the only time in his career, was enveloped. The final battle, Zama in 202 BCE, was the mirror image of Cannae. Scipio used against Hannibal the envelopment tactics that Hannibal had perfected, turned Hannibal's elephants back on his own lines by training his soldiers to open lanes for them to run through rather than being disrupted by them, and won the decisive engagement that ended the Second Punic War. Hannibal was defeated, for the first and only time in his military career, by a Roman general who had learned from everything Hannibal had done. The peace terms that Rome imposed after Zama were brutal. Carthage surrendered its war elephants and its war fleet, agreed to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years, and promised to conduct no military operations outside Africa without Roman permission. Carthage was not destroyed. Not yet. It was reduced to a subject ally, stripped of military power, and left to pay off its debt and manage its remaining North African territory under Roman supervision. Hannibal himself remained in Carthage as suffet, attempting to reform the city's finances to make the indemnity payments manageable. He was too effective. His enemies accused him to Rome of corresponding with Rome's enemies, and rather than face extradition, he fled into exile, first to the court of the Seleucid king Antiochus III, then to Crete, then to the court of King Prusias of Bithynia in Anatolia. When Rome demanded that Prusias surrender him, Hannibal chose the only alternative. He had carried poison in a ring throughout his years of exile, and in 183 BCE, the same year that Scipio Africanus died, the two greatest military commanders of the age departing together, he took it. Between the Second and Third Punic Wars, there is a 50-year gap that the dramatic arcs of the Hannibalic campaign and the final destruction of Carthage tend to compress, but which matters enormously for understanding both what Carthage was and why its eventual destruction took the form it did. In those 50 years, Carthage demonstrated something remarkable: the capacity to recover from a catastrophic military defeat and an enormous financial burden with a speed and effectiveness that should not have been possible for a city that had just been stripped of its fleet, its elephants, and its overseas empire. The economic resilience that Carthage displayed in the 50 years after Zama was a direct expression of the commercial intelligence that had made it great in the first place. The indemnity of 10,000 talents, a sum enormous by any standard, was paid ahead of schedule, a feat that the Carthaginian commercial community achieved through exactly the organizational capacity and financial sophistication that had built the empire in the first place. Agriculture in the North African hinterland was expanded and intensified. The harbour was maintained. The commercial networks that the war had disrupted were rebuilt. By the 170s and 160s BCE, Carthage was once again wealthy enough that the Roman senators who visited it, including Cato, who went as part of a diplomatic delegation in 153 BCE, came home alarmed by what they had seen. Cato's alarm was not irrational in its economic foundations, whatever one thinks of the political conclusions he drew from it. A Carthage that could pay off 10,000 talents ahead of schedule and then continue to prosper was a Carthage that retained the commercial infrastructure and the human capital, the merchants, the navigators, the agricultural managers, the financial specialists, that had made it the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean for 2 centuries. The city's military power was gone, its political autonomy was severely constrained, but its commercial genius was intact, and to Cato's Roman mind, a commercially vigorous Carthage was a Carthage that could eventually afford to challenge Rome again. The Third Punic War from 149 to 146 BCE was less a war than an execution, and the politics that produced it are among the most uncomfortable episodes in Roman history. In the 50 years between Zama and the outbreak of the Third Punic War, Carthage had recovered economically. The indemnity had been paid ahead of schedule, Carthage's commercial efficiency allowing it to discharge in 10 years what Rome had expected to take 50. The North African agricultural economy was prospering. The city was rebuilding its wealth and its population. It was not rebuilding its military. The peace terms had prohibited that. But its economic recovery was rapid enough to alarm the Romans who were watching. The man who gave the alarm its most famous expression was Marcus Porcius Cato. Cato the Elder, the censor, the most morally insistent figure in the Roman Republic, and the author of the phrase that has echoed through the subsequent history of the ancient world, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. Cato reportedly ended every speech in the Senate with this sentence regardless of the speech's subject. Having been sent as part of a diplomatic delegation to Carthage in 153 BCE, and having returned convinced that the city's economic recovery represented an existential threat to Rome. His political opponent Scipio Africanus argued the opposite, that Carthage's continued existence provided Rome with the external threat that kept Roman political culture disciplined and virtuous. Nasica was probably right, and Cato's position prevailed. The pretext for the Third Punic War was Carthage's violation of its peace treaty by raising an army to defend itself against the raids of the Numidian king Massinissa, who was Rome's ally and who'd been systematically seizing Carthaginian territory for years with Roman encouragement. Carthage, unable to defend itself by treaty terms without Roman permission, had raised an army anyway to stop the raids, giving Rome the treaty violation it needed. The Roman demand when the war was declared was for Carthage to move its entire population 10 miles inland from the sea, effectively to destroy the commercial city and its harbour. When Carthage refused, the siege began. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years, from 149 to 146 BCE. And the Carthaginian resistance during those 3 years was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the ancient world's long history of siege warfare. The city that had been stripped of its weapons by treaty obligations improvised. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. The streets of the city were converted into workshops producing weapons and armour. Every building not essential to the defence was stripped of its materials for fortification. The Romans, who had expected a relatively quick assault against a disarmed population, found themselves dealing with a city that fought for every street and every building, with a desperation that the knowledge of what defeat would bring made absolute. The people of Carthage knew what Rome intended. They had been told. They had nothing to lose. The final assault, in 146 BCE, was commanded by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the destroyer of Carthage, whose military career had brought him to this point. When the Romans breached the final defences and fought their way into the city, the fighting moved street by street, building by building, floor by floor, in urban combat of a kind that the ancient world sources describe with a specificity that speaks to eyewitness testimony. Scipio watched the city burn and, by the account of his own friend Polybius who was present, wept, not from sentiment about Carthage, but from the recognition that what was happening to Carthage might someday happen to Rome. He quoted Homer. He contemplated the transience of empires. Then he ordered the city levelled. The burning of Carthage took 17 days. The rubble was ploughed under. The salting of the earth is probably a later addition to the tradition, appearing in sources after the medieval period and not reliably attested in ancient ones. But the ploughing was real. The site was formally cursed, and the construction of anything on it was prohibited for a generation. The approximately 50,000 people who had survived the siege were sold into slavery. The territory became the Roman province of Africa. Carthage, as a Punic city, ceased to exist. What was lost when Carthage was destroyed? This is the question that haunts the historiography of the ancient Mediterranean, because the destruction of the Carthaginian libraries and administrative records, the burning of the books that might have given us the Punic perspective on the civilization's history, means that we will never fully know the answer. We have the Carthaginian agricultural treatises, partially, through the Latin translation that the Roman Senate preserved. We have Carthaginian coins, Carthaginian architecture and urban planning, as revealed by archaeology, Carthaginian votive objects and inscriptions. We have the traces of the Punic language in the transcribed Punic texts that survived by being quoted in other works, and in the communities of North Africa where Punic continued to be spoken into the Christian era. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th century CE, mentions Punic as a living language in the rural areas around Hippo Regius, which is to say that the language of Hannibal was still being spoken 5.5 centuries after the destruction of Carthage. What we do not have is Carthaginian history as Carthage would have written it. We do not have Carthaginian religious texts, Carthaginian philosophy, Carthaginian literature in any form that has survived. The entire intellectual and cultural production of a civilization that was, by any external measure, one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. A civilization that had been literate for centuries, that had administered a commercial empire of enormous complexity, that had produced the agricultural science that the Romans preserved, that had generated the seafaring tradition that made Phoenician navigation the wonder of the ancient world, is lost. Not fragmentarily lost the way that most ancient literatures are fragmentarily lost. Comprehensively lost. What was in the libraries of Carthage when the Romans burned them is unknown, and will remain unknown. The Tophet is one of the most contested sites in the archaeology of the ancient world, and its controversy is directly relevant to the question of what Carthage actually was beneath the Roman accounts that have dominated its representation. The Tophet, the Phoenician term for a sacred precinct found at Carthage and at other Phoenician sites, was a walled sacred area containing thousands of urns filled with the cremated remains of children and sometimes animals, covered by stone stelae inscribed with dedications to Baal Hammon and Tanit. The ancient sources, Greek and Roman, describe the Tophet as the site of child sacrifice. Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and other authors describe Carthaginian ceremonies at which children were killed and burned as offerings to the gods, and these descriptions have formed one of the primary elements of the Roman image of Carthaginian religious practice as barbaric. The scholarly debate about the Tophet has been one of the most vigorous in Mediterranean archaeology for the past several decades. One school of interpretation, following the ancient literary sources, holds that the Tophet was indeed a site of child sacrifice, that the urns contained the remains of children killed in religious ceremonies, and that the practice was real and systematic. Another school argues that the urns contain the remains of children who died naturally, that the Tophet was a cemetery for infant and child mortality, in a world where infant mortality was extremely high, and that the ancient accounts of child sacrifice are Roman and Greek propaganda designed to portray Carthage as barbaric and therefore deserving of destruction. The most recent forensic analysis of the skeletal remains in the urns has produced evidence suggesting that some of the children whose remains are present were older than the age at which natural infant mortality peaks, which has been used to support the sacrifice interpretation, but the scholarly argument has not been resolved and may not be resolvable from the available evidence. What is certain is that the Tophet's portrayal in ancient sources was one of the primary rhetorical instruments through which Rome justified the destruction of Carthage. Whether the sacrifice was real or invented or somewhere between the two, whether the Roman accounts were accurate reports, distorted exaggerations, or deliberate fabrications of an atrocity to justify an atrocity, the accusation served its political purpose. Carthage was portrayed as a civilization that burned its children, and the portrayal made the civilization's destruction easier to present as righteous rather than merely convenient. The Numidian kingdoms that bordered Carthaginian territory present another perspective on what Carthage was that the Roman sources tend to obscure. The Numidians, the Berber peoples of the North African interior who had been alternately subjects, allies and enemies of Carthage throughout the Punic period, interacted with Carthaginian civilization in ways that produced a genuinely hybrid cultural world in Roman-era North Africa. Numidia under Massinissa, the king who had allied with Rome in the final phase of the Second Punic War, and who had used his alliance to systematically encroach on Carthaginian territory in the years before the Third Punic War, became in many respects more Punic than Carthaginian in its cultural life as the Carthaginian centres were destroyed. Punic language, Punic religious practices, Punic artistic traditions persisted in the Numidian and Mauritanian kingdoms long after the destruction of Carthage, transmitted through the rural populations and the Punic-speaking communities that the Roman conquest had not entirely absorbed. The Punic world did not end at 146 BCE. It transformed, dispersed, and persisted in forms that the Roman province of Africa preserved without fully acknowledging. The Roman colony of Carthage, founded approximately a century after the destruction of the Punic city by Julius Caesar, and formally established by Augustus, became one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire, eventually the third or fourth city in the empire by population, the capital of Roman Africa, the city where Tertullian and Cyprian and Augustine wrote the works of early Latin Christianity, that shaped the development of Western theology. Roman Carthage was built partly on the rubble of Punic Carthage and partly alongside it, incorporating some of the Punic urban planning and adapting the harbour that the Punic engineers had built into a harbour for Roman commercial traffic. The Byrsa Hill, where Dido's legend placed the founding citadel, became the site of a Roman forum, a Roman temple, and the Roman administrative buildings of the provincial capital. The physical remains of Punic Carthage were built over, quarried, and absorbed into the Roman city that replaced them. The Roman Carthage that Augustine knew in the late 4th century CE was a city of over 300,000 people, the intellectual centre of Latin North Africa, a city whose Christians and whose pagans and whose Jews and whose Donatist heretics argued theology with the particular intensity that North African religious culture generated across the late antique period. Augustine himself, the most influential theologian of the Western Christian tradition, was born in Thagaste in Numidia, educated at Carthage, and spent much of his intellectual development in a city that still carried within its cultural memory. In the persistence of Punic language in the countryside, in the religious practices that Christianity had not entirely displaced, in the specific character of North African Christianity itself, the ghost of the Punic civilization that had shaped the landscape and the culture long before Rome arrived. The fall of Roman Carthage came in 439 CE, when the Vandal king Gaiseric captured the city and made it the capital of the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, a kingdom that lasted until the Byzantine reconquest under Belisarius in 533 CE. The Arab conquest of the 7th century CE finally ended the continuous urban history of the site, though a Tunisian city called Tunis grew up nearby, and the archaeological site of Carthage is now within the greater metropolitan area of Tunis, its ruins preserved alongside the villas of one of the wealthiest residential districts in modern Tunisia. Visitors to the site can walk through the remains of the Roman baths of Antoninus Caracalla, some of the largest in the Roman world, and see below and beside them the traces of the Punic neighbourhood that Roman construction partially preserved by burying it, the parallel layers of two great civilizations occupying the same promontory across 25 centuries. The legacy of Carthage in Western historical consciousness is a study in the power of the victors to define the defeated. For most of the period between the ancient world and the modern, Carthage was what Rome said it was, a cruel, treacherous, superstitious civilization that had the temerity to challenge Rome and receive the punishment that its deficiencies deserved. The phrase Punic faith, Fides Punica, became in the Latin tradition a synonym for treachery, the faithless enemy who could not be trusted to honour its agreements. The tradition of child sacrifice, whether historically accurate or not, served as the definitive moral indictment that placed Carthage outside the community of civilized peoples that Rome defined itself as leading. The rhetorical work of Carthage's destruction was so thorough that it was largely unquestioned for nearly 2,000 years. The problem of sources for Carthaginian history is not merely an academic inconvenience. It is a fundamental epistemological challenge that shapes every claim we can make about the civilization, and it deserves direct engagement rather than the footnote treatment it typically receives in popular accounts. We have no Carthaginian histories, we have no Carthaginian philosophy, we have no Carthaginian literature, we have a handful of Punic inscriptions, a few translated fragments, and the testimony of people who were either enemies of Carthage or who were working from sources that were themselves products of hostile traditions. The primary narrative source for the Punic Wars is Polybius, a Greek historian who was taken to Rome as a political hostage after the Third Macedonian War in 167 BCE and who became the intimate of Scipio Aemilianus, the man who destroyed Carthage. Polybius was present at the destruction of Carthage. He was standing next to Scipio when Scipio wept. His account of the Punic Wars is the most systematic and the most carefully researched that we have, and it's also the account of a man who had every personal and political reason to see Rome's version of the conflict as authoritative. He tried to be fair. He admired Hannibal, whom he described with a specificity that suggests access to sources closer to the Carthaginian side than most Roman-era writers had. But he was working within a framework of values and assumptions that Rome had shaped, writing for an audience that had won the wars he was describing, and the specific silences and emphasis of his account reflect this position in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes are not. Livy, whose history of Rome is the other major narrative source for the Punic Wars, wrote more than 2 centuries after the events he described, during the reign of Augustus. His Hannibal is a figure of terrifying military genius and profound personal flaws. Specifically, the bad faith and cruelty that the Roman tradition attributed to the Punic character, generally, and to Hannibal in particular. The Punica of the later poet Silius Italicus, the longest surviving Latin poem and an epic treatment of the Second Punic War, presents a Hannibal who is explicitly modelled on the villains of the epic tradition, a figure of demonic energy and magnificent destruction, whose defeat by the righteous Romans is the poem's moral architecture. These sources tell us enormous amounts about how Rome understood and processed its encounter with Carthage. They tell us considerably less about what Carthage understood of itself. The modern reassessment of Carthage began primarily with archaeology, with the excavation of the site that revealed beneath the Roman city a Punic civilization of genuine sophistication that the literary tradition had obscured. The archaeological Carthage that emerged from a century of systematic excavation was not the barbaric, child-burning enemy of Roman propaganda, but a city of rational urban planning, sophisticated harbour engineering, productive agricultural science, and a religious tradition that was, whatever one concludes about the Tophet, far more nuanced than the ancient account suggested. The coins, the inscriptions, the pottery, the architectural remains, the material culture of Carthage told a story different from the literary tradition, and the difference forced a reassessment of what the literary tradition was actually preserving. Roman perceptions of Carthage, Roman fears of Carthage, Roman needs to justify Carthage's destruction, rather than Carthaginian reality. Hannibal's military reputation, which even the Romans could not suppress, has been assessed and reassessed by every generation of military theorists since the ancient world, and it has consistently survived the scrutiny. The crossing of the Alps remains one of the most impressive logistical achievements in military history. Cannae remains the model envelopment battle that military academies teach alongside Austerlitz and Tannenberg. The specific tactical innovations of the Barcid commanders, the use of combined arms in the Iberian and Italian campaigns, the flexible command arrangements that allowed Hannibal to respond to developing tactical situations faster than his Roman opponents, the specific use of terrain and weather and psychology that characterized his best operations, were studied by Scipio, and through Scipio passed into the Roman military tradition, and through the Roman military tradition into the Western military tradition that military education still draws on. Hannibal lost the war. He changed the way the Western world fights it. The question of what would have happened if Hannibal had won, if Cannae had been followed by the political collapse of the Roman alliance system that his strategy required, if the Italian allies had remained with him rather than gradually drifting back to Rome, if a negotiated peace had preserved a Carthaginian empire in the Western Mediterranean, is one that has occupied historians since the ancient world itself. The Roman historian Livy, who wrote a generation after Scipio's victory at Zama, was aware that the outcome could have been different, and his awareness is visible in the care and the attention he gives to Hannibal's campaigns. More care than one would expect a Roman patriot to give to the operations of Rome's greatest enemy. The awareness that Rome had been very nearly destroyed was part of what Rome meant to itself, part of the myth of Roman virtues, the quality that had allowed Rome to absorb Cannae and keep fighting. The near miss was essential to the victory's meaning. The world that did not happen, the world in which Carthage won the Second Punic War and Rome remained a regional Italian power, is one of the most profound counterfactuals in human history. Everything that flows from Roman dominance of the Mediterranean, the spread of Roman law and Latin language, the administrative framework within which Christianity grew and became the dominant religion of the Western world, the specific form of European civilization that Roman imperial culture shaped and that the medieval period inherited and transformed, all of this becomes uncertain if Hannibal rides into Rome in 216 BCE and dictates terms. We do not know what a Carthaginian-dominated Mediterranean would have looked like, because Carthage did not leave us the documents from which to imagine it. We know what it did not look like. We know what was lost in the libraries of the city that burned in 146 BCE. We simply do not know what was in them. The night is settling in now, and the long story of Carthage has reached its end, or the end of the part of it that survives in the record, which is not quite the same thing. The city on the promontory in the Bay of Tunis endured for almost 7 centuries, from the legendary founding by Dido to the destruction by Scipio Africanus, and in those 7 centuries it was one of the organizing forces of the Western Mediterranean world, the commercial power whose ships range from the Canary Islands to the coasts of West Africa to the shores of Britain, whose merchants may have rounded the Cape of Good Hope 1,000 years before the Portuguese did, whose agricultural science was respected enough to survive the burning of everything else, whose military commanders were good enough to bring Rome to the verge of destruction and keep it there for 15 years. What Carthage was cannot be fully recovered. The evidence that would tell us is ash. What we know about it, we know largely through the accounts of the civilization that destroyed it, filtered through the specific purposes that destruction served. We know that it was feared. We know that the fear was rational, grounded in real capabilities and real achievements. We know that Hannibal Barca was real, and that his military genius was real, and that the Alps were crossed in winter with war elephants and an army that had no reason to succeed and very nearly changed the history of the world. We know that the people who made their last stand in the streets of Carthage in 146 BCE fought for 3 years against a Roman army with improvised weapons made from their own hair and the wood of their own homes, and that they knew what was coming and fought anyway. And we know that Scipio Africanus wept when the city burned, which tells you something about what was lost, even if we can no longer say exactly what it was. The ruins are still there, in the suburbs of Tunis, beneath the Roman bath complex and beside the presidential palace, and among the quiet residential streets of one of Tunisia's wealthiest neighbourhoods. The Bursa Hill where Dido built her citadel is still there, occupied now by a museum and a cathedral. The harbour basin where 220 warships once rested in their berths is still there, though the current lake that occupies the site bears only the ghost of its original shape. And somewhere below the Roman Forum and the French-built cathedral and the apartment buildings and the gardens, the Punic city is still there in its foundations, the streets and the houses and the warehouses and the temples that the Romans built over and built on top of and left in fragments beneath the city they erected, on the ruins of the city they had destroyed. The stone remembers, even when the text has burned. The shape of the hill remembers. The curve of the harbour remembers. The stele of the Tophet, inscribed with the names of people who wanted the gods to know they had been here, are still legible. The alphabet that the Phoenicians invented is still being used by different peoples in different forms in every literate culture on earth. The commercial tradition that Carthage embodied and extended, the network of ports and markets and long-distance trade routes that the Phoenician diaspora built and Carthage organised, is the ancestor of every commercial network that the Mediterranean world has produced since, ceterum censeo. Furthermore, I consider, the phrase echoes through history from the man who said it, and through Carthage's destruction to the world that destruction made. Cato died in 149 BCE, the year the Third Punic War began. He lived to see the war he had argued for begin, but not to see it end. Scipio Aemilianus, the man who commanded the final destruction and who wept at the burning, was 37 years old at the fall of Carthage. He lived another 23 years, long enough to destroy another ancient city, Numantia in Iberia, in 133 BCE, long enough to watch the political consequences of Rome's imperial expansion begin to tear the Roman Republic apart through the conflicts of the Gracchi brothers, long enough to be found dead in his bed in 129 BCE, under circumstances that suggested to many at the time that he had been murdered. The destroyer of Carthage did not die peacefully. History has that quality sometimes, of declining to give the last word to the people who thought they had earned it. But what history considers, looking back across 22 centuries at the burning of Carthage, is something more complicated than what Cato had in mind. It considers a civilization that was genuinely great and genuinely lost. It considers the specific form of greatness that was lost and the specific form that replaced it, and the question of whether the replacement was worth what it cost. History does not always answer that question with the confidence that the victors would prefer. Let that settle around you now. The Bay of Tunis is quiet tonight, and the promontory where Dido built her citadel is dark, and the Mediterranean is doing what it has always done, connecting and separating, carrying ships and carrying memories and being indifferent, in its ancient way, to the specific civilizations that have used its shores to build what they built and fight what they fought. The Punic stars are the same stars the Roman stars were, the same stars the Phoenician stars were before that. They are still there. They were there before Carthage and they are there after it, and they do not distinguish between the civilizations that have used them for navigation. The sea between. Rest easy.